Hey guys, my name is Eric Vento. This is another podcast of Government to Private, where we talk with a variety of different people who have transitioned successfully from all walks of government into the private sector. Today with us, we have Adam Korn. Adam and I have known each other for several years. We've collaborated on multiple initiatives, and I'm super happy to have him here with us today. Welcome, Adam.
Eric, good to see you, man. How are you?
Doing well, man. Doing well. You know, it's Friday, so I can't complain too much, brother.
Fantastic.
So, hey, I'd love for you just to give a high level overview, as vulnerable as non-vulnerable as you want to be, to the people who are going to be listening on the call, about your background.
Absolutely. I'll go for vulnerable. Very vulnerable.
Sounds good.
So when I was I grew up in DC, and a lot of my friends worked for the government and that were older than me, like my brothers and sisters, friends and whatnot. And I wanted to work for the government too. So I went to grad school and studied, security. This is right after 9/11. Immediately started working for the CIA. So as a contractor initially, and eventually, became a Fed. And then I've transitioned to the National Nuclear Security Administration, doing some more intelligence type work. Really enjoyed it. Did that for a number of years. And then I taught at a military university, National Defense University, for 2 years. It was a detailed assignment, and I thought that was awesome. But I really was, I spoke to quite a few people who are a little bit older than me in the federal government, and I asked them their opinion because I was having some second thoughts about being a lifer or not. And they gave me a lot of very good information, helped me make the decision to move on to the private sector. They made a very compelling argument. And then I, spent about a year and a half, really trying to make that happen. But it was definitely very, very difficult, but the outcome was fantastic. And I'd love to go into more detail of what that journey was like.
Yeah, feel free, brother.
Awesome. Well, so what happened was, I realized I was teaching at the military university, and I knew that detail assignment was only going to be 2 years. And I have to transition, back to my old job at the National Nuclear Security Administration. And I just wasn't excited for it. I just was kind of a little bit burned out. I felt like the pace of the government was a little bit slow. And there was just a lot of bureaucracy, and I was, traveling a ton, which was great. And I loved it. But, traveling, there's the reality, there's the fantasy of traveling for the government and for work. And then there's the reality. And the reality is you're in, long flights, not flying business class, at all. You're flying like coach, long flights halfway across the world, getting to, whatever, Abu Dhabi at, 1:00 in the morning, and then having to, give a presentation at 8 a.m. the next day, just zero. And then the second it's over, hopping over to the next country and being in a lot of hotels. The life of it gets kind of old fast. So I wasn't super excited to go back to the old job at the National Nuclear Security Administration. So I was kind of having an existential crisis because I only knew working for the government. I didn't know of any other reality. And I just thought I wasn't good enough to work in private sector. But that being said, I looked at all my peers, my friends who I went to high school with, college with, who all worked in the private sector, and they all were doing so much better than me financially. They weren't traveling at all. And they had boring jobs. They were like accountants and consultants, stuff like that. But they also had houses and cars and, and took really cool vacations. And, whereas I couldn't leave the country unless I was going TDY, temporary duty, and being sent to places. And then, for my vacation, I would be able to go to Daytona Beach and stuff and party. But aside from that, I was really kind of hurting for funds, and I didn't see much of a future. So what I did was, but I was like, but maybe I should just stay and retire, and then I can start living. So what I did was I found people that were about 5 years older than me who worked in federal government. And I reached out to a number of them and just said, some of them were just people I respected because I heard them speaking at a conference, or I worked with them in some capacity. And I said, would you mind if I could take you out to coffee? And I want to get your opinion on something. Should I stick around, or should the federal government, or should I go to the private sector? And all of them were just so emphatically like, get out while you can. Still a young man. And they're like, hey, they just talked about how, they're like, best case scenario, you're going to buy a house in Centerville, Virginia, or maybe Poolesville, Maryland, and, God forbid you have a kid or two, because that just means the day you retire as a Fed, you're going to have to come back as a contractor to pay for their educations. And one guy was just like, if you stay with the government, you're going to, if you stay in the government, long enough, I'm going to end up working for you as a contractor, and you're going to just be bossing me around. And he was just like, I don't like the idea of that. So I want you, he's like, I have a personal motivation to ask you to leave as well. And so I was like looking around, and, I applied to, like, hundreds of jobs, thousands of jobs in the private sector. I wasn't getting anywhere. I really didn't know what I wanted to do or what value I had, but I knew I loved security. And I was interested in like physical security. I was interested in adult education and training. And so I kept on applying for jobs, got nowhere. And finally I took a break from it. And the turning point was I finally just bit the bullet, and I hired a resume writer. I know when I worked for the federal government, and you have usajobs.gov, and if you hire a resume writer and then, other federal people see that, they know that you did it because you can tell, and they think it's lame. But if you do that in the private sector, they're like, they might know that you hired someone to really kind of give you a snappy resume and a snappy LinkedIn, and they respect it. They're like, this is a person who's smart, who outsources this type of work to people who do it. And that's what you do in the private sector, because time is money. If you can outsource things, that, that's a good thing. And that way you could focus on what really matters in the private sector. So I had to, it took me about like 3 or 4 months to find the right resume writer that I really trusted, because it cost a lot of money, and I didn't have a lot of money as a Fed. I finally found one that I thought was phenomenal. And she rewrote my resume, did an outstanding job. And, almost immediately, like the results came back, like, in terms of there started being interest in my application. This whole time I thought it was me who was not marketable, but it turns out just my resume and my persona on LinkedIn wasn't marketable for the private sector. So once I made the investment to do that, it really made a big difference. And then Google, along with, was one of the companies I applied to, and they just reached out to me and said, hey, we saw your resume. We liked it a lot. We have a position, the position that you applied to, we think you'd be a great fit. Would you like to fly out here? And I interviewed with them. It took, many months, and a background check and all these sort of things that, seemed even more comprehensive than the background check I had with the federal government at the time. And then, and then they hired me and then relocated me from DC to San Francisco. And I stayed at Google for a period of time, then moved on to Fitbit, and Fitbit to Meta, and then Meta to now where I currently work, which is at GoFundMe and Classy.org.
Man, that's awesome, man. I love listening to every single person's unique story, because that's what it is. It's unique. Everyone's trying to get to, the final destination, but the journey is different for everybody, and what may work well for you may not work well for someone else, and vice versa, and just listening to your story, I hope that every single person who listens to it is able to come to the same conclusion of there's a lot of different ways to get to the private sector.
Yeah.
There's not just one way, there's not just two ways, there's a lot of different ways, and in your case, you networked, you built a lot of relationships, you reached out to people who had gone before you and said, hey, what should I do? What's the advice, etc. You realized that, your experience wasn't being articulated appropriately on paper. And you reached out to a resume writer that you trusted, you got some really, really great results. And now you've been in the private sector for a number of years now, you've worked at some of the biggest names in the business, and, I think your story is definitely one that a lot of people are going to resonate with.
That's good. It's real. I mean, there's also a strategy I found really that worked extraordinarily well for me. Once I got into the private sector, it made things a little easier, of course. But when I was at Google, I really kind of, I spent my time there and I wanted to move on. And so, I thought, well, I got this Google on my resume and I'm going to be very marketable. And then I for some reason, I wasn't. Like, I just was like, I wasn't getting interviews, and I was having a tough time with it. So what I started doing was I started cold contacting people on LinkedIn, and just saying, hey, look, it's sort of like that, the CIA thing, you spot, assess, recruit, that sort of thing. Like, I would just say, hey, I noticed your profile on LinkedIn. I think it's amazing. You've had a really cool career that, it's awesome. You work at, this is what I did when someone who worked at Meta. And I said, because I was targeting Meta, and I just said, I think that I sent the same sort of email to like maybe 25 people at Meta. And I said that you've had a really cool career. Would you mind just like having a quick chat with me over the phone? And then, and I can learn a little bit more from you. And I made sure I didn't ask for any, when they, if I sent that to 15 people, only one responded, but that's a really good return actually. So one said, sure, I'll talk to you. Why not? And I made sure I didn't ask anything of him, on that phone call. I just said, I just asked him a lot of questions, told him how great I thought his career was. And, I asked him, hey, in the future, if I have more questions, could I reach out to you again? And then I waited a period of time, like a month, and then I emailed him and said, hey, can we set up another call? And he had a good experience with me and we had a fun conversation. So we built a friendship. Then, over time, we built a friendship. And then, it's funny, to this day, I've never met this individual because by the time I was hired to Meta, he got a job in New York and left, but he was instrumental in really securing my interview with Meta. And by the time, it took so long, but by the time I secured my interview with Meta, he already moved on, but Jordan was the one who made sure that I got an interview at Meta. And the rest was all up to me. And then come to think of it, the same exact thing happened to me at Fitbit. Like I didn't know anyone at Fitbit and I was applying for jobs and wasn't getting it. And I just cold contacted a woman who worked at Fitbit, and it was the same exact thing, built a relationship with her over a period of time. We eventually met for coffee and I let it be her idea. Like out of nowhere, she was just like, you should work at Fitbit. I think there's a role coming up that I know of. We need a new physical security manager. And why don't you put in for that? And I was like, if I give my resume to you, will you put that in? And so it's just a matter of really investing and building those relationships. And I think that's a lot of things that people miss on doing.
Yeah.
They reach out to someone and immediately ask for a favor. Like they'll get a nibble and they'll say, hey, can you please, give me an internal referral? And the person might do it or might not do it, or they might not, because there's that little box when you give an internal referral, like, how do you know this person? They'll be like, I don't know, I met them on LinkedIn and whatever, whereas if they built a relationship with you, they might write a paragraph and say like, I've known this person for about 4 months and they're extraordinarily articulate and they have this wealth of experience and they're really good with the way they communicate. And I think that would be an outstanding asset for this team that they're applying for.
Yeah, I think that raises a really good point because, the internal referral process is different by company.
Yeah.
Like, for example, at Google, it's just like what you just described. You really have to know that person. You have to be able to personally vouch for them. Whereas, with a lot of other companies, it's as simple as just providing a link, and giving it to someone with zero, like, I've known this person my whole life, or you don't have to give any kind of description whatsoever. And like a lot of companies actually have policies where they encourage people to spread that referral link as far and as wide as possible. So I used to work at TikTok, and, TikTok has an internal referral policy where you can literally just post the referral link on LinkedIn, and, thereby basically guaranteeing that literally hundreds, if not thousands of people will use that referral link. And it's not for any one job. Like, it's a referral link just in general. And so you can apply to like 10 different jobs with an internal referral, and all across the world. And so, I really think that the value of the internal referral is still high. If you follow a lot of recruiters like Amy Miller and others on LinkedIn, they talk about how internal referrals make up 40% of their hires. And it's still something that has significant value when it comes across a recruiter's desk, because ultimately, at least from my perspective, your qualifications usually get you in the door, but it's how well you fit in and how well you acclimate to the intended culture that usually gets you the job.
Yeah.
Because you can be a highly qualified individual, but not get along with anyone. And that's going to be an issue, And so, I really think that the internal referral process still has value, but it's very, very subjective depending on the company that you work for,
I'm finding a lot of companies are starting to use Greenhouse as their, internal processing system. And Greenhouse is pretty good about giving the person giving their internal referral, like a space to really, really give this person an accommodation that they should be considered extraordinary, really highly. And it's a great software. It's very easy to use as the user. Like if I want to refer someone to GoFundMe, it's very simple for me to really, write something glowing and really feel like they're getting a really good shot. So I'm happy to see that lots of companies are using Greenhouse.
Yeah, I like that. I like that because, if you just have a referral come in with no context, then, that can, sometimes it's hard to know how to interpret that, you know. Um, but at the same time, if your company doesn't have that level of functionality because of the ATS system that you're using, then all you can do is just say, well, it's a referral versus this person who's applying cold.
Well, I think
And so
one more thing you can do is you can email the hiring manager too, which I always do. I really, like the person. And I mean, when I say like, I mean, think they're very qualified. And, I just email the hiring manager and I say, hey, look, I know this individual. I work with them at Meta, or I work with them, at Google, or I work with them in the government, and they should really be considered, very strongly. Let me know if you want to have a quick meeting so we can talk about it. And I find that's also extraordinarily effective. It resonates with people. It's compelling.
yeah, because you're taking an extra step. You're going outside of the HR process, if you will, and saying, hey, I really think that you guys should consider him because of my personal recollection or my personal knowledge, and I've had that happen a few times as a hiring manager, and that's always really resonated very well with me as well. Because again, like we all of us as hiring managers, we want to make a good hire. We want someone who's going to stay for a while. We want someone who's going to contribute. We want someone who is not only qualified, but is going to be able to, interact extremely well in our team environment or within our corporate culture. And so as much context as we can get to help us make a more informed decision about that specific candidate, I think that anyone would welcome that information.
Definitely.
So.
Something I'd love to like us to talk about, if possible, to your listeners, I think that would really help them a lot in the interview process is, I'm sure that you've heard of it just because of your role, Eric. It's like the STAR method of answering questions.
Absolutely.
So like I think a lot of people, I interview a lot of people, just in general. And I mean, I have for many years, and I realize that they're answering questions in a way that's hard for me to take notes. And I'm like trying to take notes, but they're speaking in a way. And I'm like, and in my mind, I'm like, how could they not know that I can't write this story? It's not a matter of talking too fast, just the story is it lacks structure. So I'm asking them, so most of the questions that your listeners are going to get as they're interviewing for jobs are behavioral based questions. And they should really, Google the STAR method. So STAR, the STAR method of answering questions. And, that should be your format. So answer the question not the way you would just for a regular person. Answer the question knowing this person's taking notes and they want to tell a story and using the STAR method. So it's like they ask you a question, when, if ever, have you, led a project that solved a big problem for the company you worked for, and then so it's used the STAR method. The S stands for situation. You like tell the situation in a few sentences. And then then you move on to the task. What task were you given in the role that you had? Then you move down to the action you took, because you probably had a variety of options. And the R stands for result. What was the result? And I made sure like, every time I was ever, I got, let's face it, like going through interviews with like Google and Meta are not easy. And I've been very successful with them because I used the STAR method. And I just made sure like every question I answered, I would just say exactly kind of use, walk them through a story, and you see the person scribbling and taking notes, and that it's easy for them to take notes based off your story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the STAR method is one of the most common techniques that you can use, but it's also super simple, not only for the interviewer, but the interviewee. And what I recommend, especially for people who are coming out of the government world, is the STAR method is something that's kind of a foreign concept, and, understanding how the corporate interview process works will not only help you be more confident in how you respond to it, but it'll also help you in how you relay that information to the recruiter or whoever you're meeting with. Because, I always recommend, like I do a lot of mock interviews with people, and I always recommend, because it's the same process I use for myself, that when you're interviewing, especially in this age of remote interviewing where it's so easy to be able to do this. Like you couldn't do this in person, but for remote interviews, I just have the STAR method on the wall behind me.
Oh yeah.
And I have the examples. I have, so it's while I'm looking at the person, on camera, I can also look beyond the camera and look at exactly, okay, I want to focus on this, I want to focus on that, and even as many times as I've done interviews, like literally hundreds over the years, not only for my own jobs, but for others, you still get excited. You still get excited and you momentarily forget to utilize the STAR method or something similar. And so you jump right in and then you realize, crap, I need to go back and I need to ensure that I'm giving them exactly the information that they asked for, but they also know that why this information matters.
Yeah.
And so like when you're envisioning the STAR method and you practice on multiple questions, then you can really say like, hey, this was the issue, here's how I solved it, and here's why it matters.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, like when I'm doing like the LinkedIn aspect, especially, like LinkedIn has this really cool feature of like when you click on the jobs section of LinkedIn, there's a little toolbar on the left and there's interview prep. And they have this list of 25 to 50 questions, the most commonly asked questions that you can encounter in an interview. Like, tell me about yourself, and all the behavioral based questions that you alluded to earlier. But I always tell people, like, go in there and start practicing.
Yeah.
Look at the framework of how you should respond to every single question and just utilize the STAR to start. How would I answer that? How would I keep this big example that I have in my head to 2.5 minutes max?
Yeah.
And give people just a really, comprehensive understanding of what you did and what was the impact, but without going into all the very, very technical jargon that, you may have from law enforcement or the military and stuff like that.
That's a good point. Like one thing I, really would like to stress to, people in the federal government, law enforcement is, if you can say it in 4 words, don't say it in 8, sort of thing. And to this day, like when I get communications from people in the government, even in my current role, like they send me these block formation paragraphs that you would, the way people used to write like in the 70s, and you're just scrolling through it and you're just like, this is a joke. I'm not going to read any of this. Like, every email you write to someone in the private sector, everything needs to be above the fold, meaning that they're not having to scroll through your email. And it means you're going to have to put a lot more effort and energy in and subtract things that aren't important in your email communications to them. Like I've gotten thank you letters from people in the federal government, after an interview. And it's just like, and the thank you letter turned me off. I'm like, this is how they think that we write in the private sector. Like it needs to be a sentence and that's it. Hey, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. It was great meeting you. It's like, and it sounds curt. But that's the way we communicate, like especially in tech, maybe not in all, maybe not old school companies, the private sector, some dusty old bank or something, but in tech and more companies that are more on the progressive, like it's just very quick communication. And that's it, that's very admirable. And, I find that even like when I've tried, people in the federal government have reached out to me for help in their transition. And I say, cool, send me your resume. And they'll have it just like their USA job, jobs.gov resume, and it'll be like pages and pages. And I'll say, hey, narrow this down to 1 page. And they fight me on it. And they go, no, I've done all these great things. And it talks about these like special operations they were involved in, joint task force. I'm like, no one in the private sector, they're not going to think it's as cool as you think it is. Like they really, it's funny when you speak to, FBI agents all the time about that. They went in thinking that everyone thinks it's cool to work for the FBI, and it is, but they didn't know that they would be like, they knock on a door and be like, hi, I'm so-and-so with the FBI. And then the person answers the door and they're like, what do you want? And, beat it. Like, and you're just like, in their mind, they're like, I thought that I'd get some respect, but you're just like, but the public is not as impressed as you think they'll be. And also, depending on like where you're applying in the country, they might have a negative view of kind of what you did. Like not everyone's thrilled that I worked for the CIA that I've met in the Bay Area. They're like, baby killer, sort of, they were just like, you're why everything is all screwed up sort of thing. Or they would, get testy with me at like a cocktail party, like, I heard that you did this, and like, why, how do you feel about that? And they want me to justify like my past and existence. And it's not like, I did anything that exciting anyway. So it is an interesting, you have to kind of adjust your perspective, and you got to bite the bullet, realize you can't use your USA, .gov resume anymore.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of, like in the financial institution sector, within AML, there's a word called KYC, which is know your customer. And it's basically how we verify that people are who they say they are, when they're applying for bank accounts and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I kind of adjusted that a little bit to the resume writing and said like KYA, which is know your audience, because, like I recently worked with an FBI guy out of San Antonio, and he's led, domestic and international counterterrorism squads, for the past 15 years. And he's like, does that stuff even translate? I'm like, absolutely it does, but not in the format that you currently have it. Yeah. And again, if you happen to get someone on the other end of that phone call who is a law enforcement person or came from the federal law enforcement or intelligence community, you just lucked out. Yeah. But for most people, they have no idea what you do beyond either a personal experience they have with most likely a local police officer, or maybe someone in their family has had an experience. Maybe they like watching Cops on Friday night, whatever the case may be. Like, they are not nearly going to have the context that they need to accurately correlate your current federal law enforcement responsibilities to the private sector. And so I'm just like, I always tell people, I want you to always think that there's some 22-year-old person fresh out of college who's evaluating your resume, and all they're looking at in that pre-screening role that most companies have is this resume, does this resume meet the minimum qualifications for this job? Yes or no? If yes, move them forward. If no, I don't care how amazing you are. Thanks, but no thanks. And it's like, I struggle with the same thing, to be honest, Adam. Like, I have a lot of amazing stuff on my resume, at least from my perspective. And I'm like, I want to include that. I want to include everything on my resume. I want people to know how awesome I am, or what experience this is. But at the end of the day, every single job description is like a roadmap. Yeah. It's like the hiring manager and the recruiter is saying, this is exactly what we want. This is what we need. And this is what we're looking for. And so that's the whole purpose of like tailoring your resume and understanding how to articulate your experience. Because, if you think about it, like if you have two people who submit a resume to the same job, and we're just assuming that same number of years of experience, same industry, all that stuff, and one person just gives a job description from USA Jobs, and they're just saying, basically what you would find on a normal job description, they put it for their entire resume, and the other person is saying exactly how they meet those requirements, and they're using metrics, they're using, short stories to explain what their impact was, and how they met the expectations, et cetera. Obviously, this is a super subjective question, but who are you most likely to move forward to an interview? Interview processes are expensive, because they take a lot of time, and so you only want to move people forward who you think stand a really good chance of not only passing the hiring manager's expectations, but also, actually making it to the final round. Yeah. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think that, you really got to make sure that you're extraordinarily, you're when you have the actual interview, you got to make sure that you're just answering, at the end of the day, just answering the question. And at the end, they really want to know that, can you program manage? Can you manage people? Can you adapt to the different culture of the private sector? That is quite different from the federal system. They really want to know that, can you be really well organized and well spoken? And no one really cares that you led like a joint task force. They just don't, it doesn't always, in the private sector, it doesn't always translate. They don't know what that means. What they really want to hear is like about a program that you managed that was complex, dealt with lots of cross-functional partners, and have your stories like wired tight. in terms of explaining how that worked and how that functioned and how you identified a problem and resolved it. And they really want to see, like, how do you manage budgets, like, and give concrete examples of you've had, and you can kind of really, one advantage you do have coming from the government is that you probably managed budgets in the millions upon millions and millions of dollars. And your budget might be for your particular office that of the position you're interviewing for might be quite smaller. So you can kind of boast that you're used to dealing with these huge numbers and these huge allocations, and therefore you're very apt at budget management. And you can talk about, the fact that, the government's huge. So you probably manage like huge groups of people. Like even as a young federal employee, I was managing like, 50, 60 contractors across the globe. And some of them worked for national laboratories. Some of them worked for just random contracting firms and subcontractors. And then I managed other feds. So it shows like it boasts like a really kind of cool story. You have a cool story to tell, but you have to tell it in the frame that makes sense to the private sector. And if you don't know how to do that, reach out to your friends in the private sector and say, I'm going to tell you a story of something cool I did with the federal government. How do I translate it? How do I put it in a different language that makes sense to the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And a lot of the people that I get are not in people management. Like they never made it to the supervisory ranks, and so they're like, well, I don't have that budget management experience. I don't have that people management experience. What do I focus on? And I'm like, well, you may not have that experience, but there's plenty of other things that you can focus on, like you can still lead a program as an individual contributor. You can still talk about the number of investigations that you've conducted and what they were, and then you can articulate how that correlates to the private sector. You can talk about community public outreach. You can talk about process efficiency. Like, what did you identify that was inefficient or costing a lot of money or decreasing morale? What did you put into place to fix it? And then what was the measurable impact?
Well, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. No, you got me excited. No, because it makes perfect. And if you don't have that in your experience, so it took me a year, like basically a year and a half to leave the federal government to get a private sector job. And when I did, it was a doozy. I got to work for Google. But, basically I had a year and a half. And if you don't have that experience, if you're working in law enforcement or some other federal position or military, realize that this might take a year and a half. So that's, the good part about that is you have a year and a half to find those experiences in your federal role. So you can go to your supervisor and say, hey, look, I want to really kind of expand my skill sets here. Is there anything I could take off your plate, that where I can learn? And then your supervisor might say, well, what do you have in mind? And you can kind of direct them to say, I want to, be a little smarter about how I deal with budgets. And the federal government is often pretty generous about, giving you that training somewhere. There's probably a federal training somewhere. And I know, like, it was Department of Agriculture had classes. I know when I was at National Nuclear Security Administration, which is, semi-autonomous organization under Department of Energy, they would say, if I asked for any training, they would say, yeah, go to the Department of Agriculture's training facility and you could take a budget class. And I remember like doing that and then being able to put that bullet point in my resume that I, all of a sudden acquired more expertise in budget management. I know it sounds boring, but it's something that's really needed in the private sector. You're going to need it as you move up in the private sector. There's no getting away from it. Even if you hate spreadsheets, like it's one of those, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to get good at it. And it's just the way it is. But once you get good at it, you will love it. And it's not that bad anymore. So it's like,
I tell a lot, one of the most common questions I get is, well, I've worked for a small town PD. We only have 30 officers, like, I don't know what I've done, and I'm like, the average patrol officer on an average day does more than most people will ever know, whether it's communication, talking with people, using de-escalation and active listening to effectively communicate, whether it's talking people off a bridge, whether it's crisis management, whether it's, leading an operation. Like if you're leading a search warrant or an arrest warrant, you're still leading an incident. You're directing others in pursuit of a common objective. You're focusing on safety, you're focusing on communication, you're focusing on a lot of different things that all have roots in the private sector. Maybe it's emergency management. Maybe you're responding to a natural disaster. Maybe you're doing a tabletop exercise. Maybe you're presenting and you're, creating a course curriculum or delivering training and roll call, or, and an academy setting, like God, there is so much there, and that's just from an individual contributor perspective.
Yeah.
So obviously once you get up into the administrative ranks, then you start talking, just like you were alluding to, the budget management, profit and loss, direct reports, indirect reports, contractors. I tell people all the time, did you manage a CI? That's a contractor in my book.
Yeah.
And because that's literally the definition of the contractor.
Yeah.
They're getting paid by the city to be at a certain performance level. That's a contractor.
Another thing that they can focus on, like while you're applying for their jobs, you can read all about compliance regulation as it results to physical security. And not a lot of people like can boast that they know a lot about it if they, and they don't really, it's like, I can't rely on my legal teams to interpret compliance, regulation for me. I have to kind of understand it myself and use it as justification for my programs. So I spent like, hours. If I could go back in time, I learned, all the compliance rules and regulations for physical security, later on as I came to the private sector. But if I could go back in time, I would start reading up on, OSHA duty of care and that sort of thing now, becoming a subject matter expert. And you don't have to take a class on it. It's like, just read the compliance, take, copious amount of notes, have a big whiteboard behind your computer, and have all the pertinent information of OSHA duty of care and see how that applies to the private sector. And once you, a reason why a lot of private sector companies have physical security programs is because of OSHA duty of care. They have to for compliance rules that covers workplace violence prevention and all kinds of things, even travel safety and security, risk management. And you can often use that as a reference point during the interview process. So it shows that the compliance rules and regulations. So I think that's also would be a critical thing for you to highlight when you're being interviewed, and get smart on it now while you're applying. And also, maybe decide if you want to be a generalist or if you want to be, a specialist in something in particular. I find that when I speak to law enforcement, military, federal employees who want to transition out, they don't know. They haven't really done the thought exercise, whether to be a generalist or, whether to be a specialist in one particular thing. Like, I consider myself a generalist. My thing is I build physical security programs for companies. I built Fitbit's first ever physical, enterprise comprehensive physical security program that covers, access control, threat analysis, and, protective intelligence, executive protection, security guard management, safety and security training programs. I build these very comprehensive, investigations programs. And so I just decided very early on I was going to be a generalist, and it served me very well. It's made me versatile, and it's helped me get director roles and that sort of thing. And I have other people who just don't really want to learn all that stuff. They want to be a specialist. And, in one case, one of my friends, he was an FBI agent, and he just really wanted to focus on investigations. And that's really, he didn't want to move outside that box, and that's cool too. But he has to own that and really figure out how can he market himself that way. So, I think that's a thought exercise a lot of your listeners should really potentially do. Decide if you want to be a generalist of some kind, or if you want to be a very particular specialist. And once you to make that decision, fully commit to it the best you can by marketing yourself that way.
Gotcha. Yeah. And that's really what you were kind of talking about in the beginning of our conversation, Adam, is the networking aspect. You don't know what you don't know. That's why it's great to listen to these podcasts and just get a sense of all the different stories and experiences across the board, because then you can go out and have those conversations with people. I recommend to people all the time, make a list of your top 10, top 15 target companies. Then go find the person who's in the role that you think sounds fun or interesting at each of those companies. Obviously, if you can leverage your network to facilitate an intro, do that. But if you don't, just reach out cold. Try to have a 15, 20-minute conversation about, hey, how did you get there? How can I make myself more competitive? What does your day-to-day responsibilities look like? Do you like working there? What's the culture like? Because the more information that you have about that specific role and the industry and even the company will allow you just to make a really, really informed decision.
Yeah, I agree. It's never be shy about cold contacting. That's what LinkedIn's for. never be shy about it. You're not, but prepare to be a little hurt, because if you reach out to like 15, 20 people, only one will respond. And but that is a good rate of return. That's better odds than dating apps. It's like, so it's
Yeah.
like, it's actually a good return. If if you swipe 20 times and someone responds, that's a pretty good deal. So yeah, I would say, like, never be shy about it. Just send them an email and make it personal. If it's cut and paste, they'll know. But if you say, hey, look, I noticed that you were in the Army around the same time I was, or I noticed that you we're law enforcement here. I was in a law enforcement in a town the same exact size, across the country, but it was the same size. I'm sure you and I would have a lot to talk about. And I want to also learn how you transitioned. And, if you make it personal, like, people reach out to me all the time on LinkedIn that I don't know. And I think it's, and I am flattered. Like, when they say something, just, they give me the smallest nugget of kindness. And like, they're just kind of like, hey, you've had a cool career. I'm like, maybe it's because I'm insecure. I'll be like, really? And then and then I'll be happy to talk to them. And I think that's, it really works. It may not be comfortable for you. And also it's time consuming, and you'll probably be frustrated because your rate of return is relatively low, or relatively high, depending how you look at it. But, just know that, let's just say that's the rate of return. If you send out 20 cold emails to people on LinkedIn, trying to get their attention, only one will respond, but that's still a very valuable rate of return. And that person very well can get you the job you want.
I always, when I'm going through some of the packages that I do with people, I go through like job search strategies on LinkedIn, because I think a lot of people don't realize how powerful the LinkedIn job search functionality is. Like, there's a lot of filters, there's a lot of things that you can use to really drill down. And one of the things that I tell people is, when you're going through like the employees for, say, GoFundMe, if you see a job there as an investigator, one of the first things that I'm looking for is, I want to find how many investigators GoFundMe has. And then once I identify that through using like, the investigator job title or investigation as a keyword on GoFundMe's LinkedIn page, then I want to find people who have the highest chance of potentially responding back to me. And the biggest way that you can do that is through a shared background.
Yep.
And so, I tell people all the time, well, now that you have the list of, let's just hypothetically say there's 50 people who have investigator in their job title at GoFundMe. Now put investigator and law enforcement. Now we're going to pull all the people who have law enforcement and investigator somewhere in their job title, their background, their LinkedIn profile. And yeah, you may get a couple of corporate people who worked as like a law enforcement analyst at Meta or something like that. But a lot of that will pull, well, this guy used to be a deputy sheriff. This guy used to be a police officer. This guy used to be X. And so if you reach out to those individuals and say, hey, I really love to talk to you. I see that we share a background in law enforcement, and I'm really looking to transition, that person, and at least in my opinion, is much more likely to respond now than just getting a cold message, because you have a shared background that you can relate to.
Definitely. And there's also methodology. You can get people to come to you by, doing kind of what I do. As you know, I write articles on LinkedIn, and, it's not, writing articles is just not that hard. It just isn't. Once you just sit down and you pick a topic that you're really excited about. And then people in law enforcement, military, government, all have really cool stories that people are interested in. Really kind of hone down, like, think about what's the most interesting story you have, and how could it help people, in their jobs, no matter where they work, some important life lesson, and write a very personalized article about it, and find a very cool graphic and publish it on LinkedIn. Like, I've only published like maybe 7 or 8 articles on LinkedIn, but I've gotten like hundreds and maybe even thousands of people who have connected with me, and maybe hundreds of emails of people who like just said, hey, look, I appreciate it. I'm always surprised that people still read, and they do read the articles that you post. And then they reach out to you and they say, I'm having a little bit of an issue at my company that is related to the article you wrote. May I set up some time to speak with you about the issue I'm having? And I was go, yeah, sure. But if I was like, if I was a cop and I was like, and I wrote an article that was like kind of, very interesting and compelling, like, write it about like, workplace violence or something like that, from a, you could write an article saying workplace violence from a law enforcement perspective. or something like that, and if you write that article and it's from your perspective, I don't know if you'll have to get permission to publish it or not from your department, but, go ahead and look at the process for that, write that article. You might, there's no shame in hiring a professional editor to write the article, hire a professional editor, pay him $100 or whatever to say, hey, can you make sure that my grammar is on point? And if I could say this a little sharper, whatever. It's just it's not a big investment. It's, it's going to be basically,
Absolutely.
it's going to be 5 hours or 6 hours on a Sunday, and then $100 to pay a professional editor to make sure your grammar's on point, or run it through chat. You can run it through Chat GPT and say, fix the grammar on this thing I wrote, and it'll fix it up for you. And, but I personally like the human touch. And then publish it on LinkedIn with a cool graphic, and, and ask all your friends on LinkedIn and all your contacts to repost it for you. Google the ideal time to post an article, and then people will come to you, and then, here you are, like a law enforcement officer, and then someone at a company might say, hey, I'm the head of physical security at this company.
Right.
I'm having a domestic, I'm having a lot of high risk terminations, and I'm a little worried about it. Can you give me your perspective on this or that? And then you go, sure, no problem, I'll help you out. And then you have a meeting and a talk. And then at the end of that meeting, you say, hey, look, I'm interested in potentially transitioning from law enforcement to you or anyone have an open position I could apply for.
Yeah, I love that approach, brother. And I could not agree more. Unfortunately, we have to start the wrap up process, but is there any other advice that you would like to give to people who are currently considering or in the middle of a transition?
Yeah, I think I would just go back to that original thing I spoke about, is deciding, I keep on speaking to people who don't know what they want to do in the private sector. And I feel like there's no excuse for that. I think that is really dependent on you being self-reflective. And then it's dependent on you internally, and then externally doing your research and talking to people. If you don't really know what you want to do in the private sector, you haven't really, done the work, essentially. I know it sounds harsh to say that, but it means you have internal work to do and external work to do. Your internal work to do is ask yourself, like, what do you really love doing? And a lot of people surprisingly don't know the answer to that question, because they'll be like, I don't know, I just want to work in the private sector and make more money and be out of my current situation. And that's not, that's not an answer. It's like, what do you really want to do? What do you enjoy? What do you like? And then there's the external work of doing research and talking to people, which is time consuming and can be frustrating and full of rejection, but you just got to do it. So I would say that would be my main advice.
Awesome. Well, I could not agree with you more on that, Adam. And, that's where networking and just talking to as many people as you can, about all the different jobs that are available out there will help give people a lot of context as to, I think I would like to do this, but now that I've talked to someone, not really, and vice versa, and just getting a good understanding is really, really helpful. But Adam, I really, really appreciate your time today. You've given us a lot to think about, and I really, really hope that whoever listens to this finds a lot of value as well. If you did find value, please reach out to either one of us or both of us, leave a comment on the post, and really take this advice to heart, because, if we can do it, you can do it.
That's very true.
So, but yeah, Adam, thanks again for your time, brother, and I hope you have a good day.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Great to see you again. Yep,
You
take
too,
care.
man. Bye.
Later.